In 1959, a democratic reform was introduced to Tibet, where politics and religion were separated. But the Dalai Lama, exiled in India, continued to be active as a religious leader in the international community.
佢而家呢就係改變咗嗰個策略，而且以嗰個宗教個身份呢係周遊全球啊！佢每年有50%嘅時間喺世界個地步，使得嗰個西方嗰個社會呢就接受咗佢講嘅嗰啲嘢。
Although the Tibetan government has elements of a democracy within it, such as the Garsha being elected by committee, in essence, it is still a theocracy.
61年一直到63年，他们起草流亡政府的这个宪法的时候啊，达赖喇嘛都建议，就是说要由议会选举的领袖来代替他达赖喇嘛的这样一个传统的政教合一的领袖的地位。但是呢，这些流亡的藏人都不同意，所以在西藏实行政教合一的这个制度啊，它有它比较深的历史的宗教的这样一个传统。
On October 25th, 1951, the PLA reached Tibet and the Chinese red flag was raised on its mountain peak. 8 years later, when the Dalai Lama was on a visit to India, revolt broke out in Lhasa, leading to his 50 years of exile. What was the reason? Find out in our next episode, Dalai Lama, the Exiled.
In 1935, Chiang Kai-shek's troops surrounded Mao Zedong's Red Army in the Tibetan highlands, forcing them to change direction and head north. When the Red Army entered Sichuan, they had run out of food and ammunition. The once 300,000-strong army had shrunk to 1/10 of its original size. Local Tibetans gave them shelter and food and took care of injured troops. With their help, the Red Army climbed over the snowy mountains to Shanxi, where they built a stronghold. In an interview with American journalist Edgar Snow, Mao said, "This is our only debt, but someday we will pay the Tibetans back the goods we had to take from them." Deng Xiaoping also commended the Tibetans for doing their best to preserve the Red Army.
14 years later, the communist troops returned to Tibet. They were no longer fugitives in rags, but triumphant forces that had seized full political control in China. How were they going to pay back the Tibetan people? 57 years since Tibet's peaceful liberation, what kind of policies had the central government implemented in the region?
Before 1950, Tibetan people lived under a feudal serfdom. The power of the secular government and spiritual authority were inseparable, similar to the Middle Ages in Europe. Their tools and methods of production were primitive. Serfs did not have personal freedom or rights. They were more like slaves, and their owners could sell them as they wished. The Communist government wanted to make some changes. In 1950, the People's Liberation Army arrived in southwestern Tibet, but they were barred from entering the region.
毛澤東就佢好重視西藏啦。佢大家知道佢對個元朝、明朝、清朝以來嗰個即係歷代嗰個皇帝對中國個疆土嗰個重視咧，佢好熟悉呢個歷史嘅。
Tibet has long been regarded as a strategic region because of its terrain. It is mountainous and is also the source of several major Asian rivers. But because of the enormous religious influence in the region, central governments of previous dynasties realized that securing the territory would be most easily achieved through diplomacy rather than force. Mao Zedong adopted a similar policy. The PRC government signed a 17-point agreement with the Tibetans for the peaceful liberation of Tibet. This completed China's unification, with the exception of Taiwan. At that time, Beijing made some concessions to Tibet's theocratic feudal system by not pushing democratic reforms. However, reforms were hinted at in the agreement. Clause 11 said in matters related to various reforms in Tibet, there will be no compulsion on the part of the central authorities. However, the latter part of the clause clearly stated that the Tibetan government should carry out reforms of its own accord. The central government realized the importance of the Tibetan ruling class. It invited the 14th Dalai Lama and the 10th Panchen Lama to Beijing to attend the first session of the National People's Congress and appointed them vice chairman of the NPC and Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, respectively. This was the honeymoon period between the Chinese Communist Party and the ruling class of Tibet. The 14th Dalai Lama even wrote a poem praising Chairman Mao. Recently, the Dalai Lama revealed that he had wanted to join the Communist Party, but the party asked him to wait a while.
我聽嗰個達賴喇嘛嘅二國加洛登珠都講咧，佢喺50年嗰陣時，50年51年咧，佢特登從美國翻到西藏，佢去咗嗰邊咧，佢就覺得嗰個西藏咧就嗰啲老百姓好苦，咁啊佢就同嗰個中央政府駐嗰個西藏嘅代表講，應該實行嗰個土地改革，但係咧佢話中央政府咧唔睬佢，要嗰個時候嘅政策啊，係協助嗰啲貴族嘅政策。佢話佢個姐夫都係貴族，佢哋就係成日可以去中央政府嗰邊攞錢啊，就派嗰啲銀元啊，嗰啲銀元佢話好重，一年半年派一次，一攞就係攞麻袋去攞㗎。
其實當時個西藏社會嘅矛盾好犀利，即係上層同下層。咁大家知道共產黨佢係通常都係支持下層啦，支持嗰啲貧窮嘅嗰啲藏人。咁達賴喇嘛或者話佢嗰個即係西藏嗰上層啦，嗰啲貴族佢哋同北京之間就有咗矛盾。咁到咗59年，嗰個矛盾就爆發。
In 1955, the Sichuan Provincial Party Secretary Li Jingchuan carried out land reforms. The serfs in the Tibetan-inhabited area of Sichuan, who had long been suppressed, burned the account books that recorded their debts. The affected serf owners, with the support of the CIA, set up a guerrilla army. Soon, there were riots in Lhasa, and the Dalai Lama fled. Mao Zedong said, "There are some people abroad who have sympathy for only 10 to 20,000 people, at most 30 to 40,000 people. However, in the three main Tibetan areas, there's a total of 1.2 million people. If you subtract 10,000 people from that, there are still more than 1.1 million people whom some in this world don't sympathize with. We have sympathy for the 1.1 million people, but not the minority."
In 1959, democratic reforms were officially carried out in Tibet. Past serfs came together in communes. In the following year, the Dalai Lama's government in exile also implemented political reforms. The theocratic serfdom of Tibet, which started back in the 10th century, came to an end.
喺一般嘅藏人嘅家庭裏邊，你會見到毛主席嘅相，同埋咧啲活佛嘅相，佢擺埋一齊嘅。而逢係擺毛主席嘅相嗰啲咧，多數都原體係農奴出身。
The spiritual leaders of Tibetan Buddhism fled under the accusation that they had divided the nation. Tibetan serfs who were released from slavery apparently worshipped Mao like a god. When the Cultural Revolution began, the Chinese Red Army called for the 4 artifacts to be destroyed: the Longmen Caves, the White Horse Temple, the Confucius Temple, and many other sites in central China were destroyed, along with thousands of monasteries and statues of Buddha. There's an old Chinese saying, "Where the nest is overturned, no egg stays unbroken." During the Cultural Revolution, religion, culture, and the economy of Tibet were devastated, as in many other areas of the nation. With the death of Mao Zedong and the end of the Cultural Revolution, religious sentiments that had been buried beneath Buddha's soil were rekindled. In Lhasa, discontent and unrest emerged. In December 1978, Deng Xiaoping made a comeback. He extended an olive branch to the Dalai Lama, who had been in exile for almost 2 decades. Soon after, relatives and envoys of the Dalai made a homecoming visit to Qinghai for the first time in many years, and proposed a visit to Tibet as well. But the central authorities were worried it would cause unrest, and they consulted the leaders of Tibet, who reassured them that their people would stay calm. However, when the envoys arrived in Lhasa, tens of thousands of Tibetans gathered, and the situation got out of control.
我们所到之处，群众都把我们挤成一团。而你知道的，因为我们是达赖喇嘛派来的，藏人全都来了。当然，知道我是达赖喇嘛的妹妹，他们都来要求祈福，来要达赖喇嘛的照片。他们只是想来摸摸我们。
The situation caused Beijing to make big adjustments to their policies in Tibet. Join us after the break.